excited to be here. Kent asked a wonderful question. He said, how long have you, or either Kent or the bishop, how long have you been doing this? How long have you been working with this question of generations? And so I thought I would start with just a quick story about how I got into this. And I got into it against my will. It was not something I ever intended to do, anything I ever wanted to do. I was a youth ministry person because youth ministry is the coolest ministry, right? You get to wear t-shirts and jeans all the time, you get to go on really fun trips, you get really tired a lot, but it's worth it. You get to do a lot of fun things. And so I ended up in coming out of seminary and going into camp and retreat ministry, which is how a lot of us get our calls. Those of us who are clergy a lot of times end up getting that from camps and retreats. Those of us who are laity often get some of our own calls into different ministries through camps and retreats. And so that ended up being where I served actually for the first 8.5 years of my ministry. And at this camp and retreat center, I was excited because camp is kids and youth, right? So that fits right into this cool factor that I'm going for with my ministry. And so I came in the middle of summer, which is a weird time to come into a camp and become part of the leadership staff. But one of the first weeks I was there was family camp. And I thought that was the worst idea I had ever heard. I loved camp because you got rid of all of those parents who were the ones that caused all the problems, right? And so you got to do the really good stuff of fixing the kids, getting them back on track, and then you send them back to their parents for a year, and then you come back and do it again the next summer. I didn't have this message in my head explicitly, but now looking back, I realized that was kind of how I was conceiving of youth ministry, as against and over and against the rest of the church, over and against parents, over and against family, as this separate thing. And so going into family camp, I was like, fine, we'll do this for a week, and then we'll get back to the really good stuff. And what I saw at that family camp was something I had never in my life encountered, which was 3 and 4 generations at camp together, worshiping together, playing together, just hanging out together. And it was good. It was really, really good. And I didn't know why at that time, and then we moved on with the rest of our summer. So that was about 9 years ago. And then that fall, I had an experience of a church showing up, or a church had called that summer and said, we want to do a youth retreat, and we want you to run it for us. And I said, sounds great. I'm a youth person. This is going to be wonderful. I know how to do this. And so I planned a retreat for this church. They said, well, I have about 30 people coming. And they showed up, and their cars streamed into the parking lot. And as people got out of the cars, I noticed very few teenagers. I said, okay, there were little kids, there were older adults. There were probably in this group of 30 about 5 teenagers. And I went up to the leader, I said, I thought this was going to be a youth retreat. He said, yeah, the youth wanted to go on retreat. And so the whole church came along. And at that time, and I had to revamp some curriculum, let me tell you. But at that moment, I go, oh my gosh, this is interesting. And I watched that weekend, and I could not tell whose kids belonged to whom, because they were all climbing all over each other, and the older kids took care of the younger ones, and everybody just did everything together. And that church wouldn't have known an intergenerational church model from anything else. It was just what they did and who they were. And so when we talk about connecting generations, those are the 2 most formative experiences. And again, even at that time, I didn't know this is anything that I wanted to do. Those were just 2 of those first formative experiences for me, that as I continued to do intergenerational camps at this camp for which it was part of their culture, I had to lead them. I had no choice. That was my job. And I kept watching them work. I kept watching it be good. And so I am just nerdy enough. Lydia said, "This is what you're doing your doctorate on?" And I said, "No, I'm just doing this because it's interesting to me." Doing all of this research and digging into why does it work? Why does it work, and why is that powerful? And what happens if we just get a little taste of that and do a little bit of that? And so when we talk about youth and when we talk about families, we can talk a lot about that today. But what I want to be sure is that we don't just talk about youth and their families. We have to talk about the whole ecosystem of generations in our church. We can't just talk about one generation or two generations. We have to talk about how that fits into the bigger picture. So we've got a lot of different directions we can go. I'm going to do sort of an overview of some things this morning, and then this afternoon, those of you who choose to spend more time with me, we are going to have a little bit of a choose your own adventure option, because I have a few different directions we can go depending on what you want to focus on then. So let's get started with my clicker working. So I want to start with you. I like conversations more than I like presentations. So I invite you to speak up, ask questions, say, "Hang on, tell me more about that." But I want just a quick snippet of maybe a story or a vignette or an encounter or an experience. If you were going to tell me the whole story of this, I hope this is probably a longer story than we have time for. But if you think about how your faith was formed personally, give me a quick little snippet of how that happened. Yes.
Religious school 5 days a week, my church on Sunday.
Okay.
So you got it as a child, you got a big dose of teaching,
Okay.
and I think that would be. And they were living their faith.
Who's they?
I went to Catholic school.
Okay.
And as an Episcopalian.
Mm-hmm.
So I could see them living, faith.
Who's they?
Well,
Who's them?
the people in authority.
Okay.
Kids are always watching. If you tell them not to do something, they're going to look and see if you're doing it. So that night they didn't have play feet. But my church definitely with Sunday school, we had a powerful Sunday school. So that was, I think that if you're starting young,
Sure.
sometimes you get older, you go, oh my gosh, you're trying to connect some of the things you learned and they don't always connect. But that would be a big initial for me.
Okay. Great. Anybody else?
First grade, sincere catechesis. Who is God? God made me to know Him, love Him, and serve Him. And that was just the start of heavy catechesis.
How'd you find that out?
From teacher.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Mine would have been started with my parents, and then, like Vivian, I also went to a Catholic high school as an Anglican/Episcopalian, and then after that chapter of my life ended, my faith would have been formed by the community around me and my faith community.
One more. Yeah, go ahead.
I was raised a Baptist. We were very proud to say that our Pope is the Bible. And so I was raised with Bible stories, beginning and then reading it, translating it with our teachers. It was very meaningful in the formation of my faith.
So there's a lot of things going on here. There's a lot of education in this. I find that interesting that sometimes we forget that sometimes things like catechesis, things like school, we want to talk about these monumental sort of retreat or camp experiences. I hear those stories all the time. But some of those experiences over time with teaching and those relationships. The Bible itself. I hope we all believe that is one of our faith-forming pieces. That is something that helps us form our faith. But I would bet that very few of us would have ever just picked up the Bible, read it, and we would have been good. probably needed people to read that with. You need people to teach you. You need people to have those conversations. And chances are in all of these different scenarios, the people in these scenarios are not people of our same generation. Some of them were formalized teachers. Some of them were family members. We need that intergenerational community for faith to be formed at all. And so as you think about your faith journey, chances are you are thinking of names and faces as much as you are thinking of books and experiences. You're thinking of names and faces. And so we want to think about, when we think about young people, but really people of any age, we talk about young people as though they are the only ones whose faith needs to be formed. And yet we also need to continue in faith formation. So when we look at intergenerational faith formation, I love research. I love looking at the research because it gives us a great sort of big picture starting point within which to frame our own experiences. If you're in the back, you probably can't read these. I'm going to read them out loud. If you want slides later, email me. I will be glad to send those to you. The first is some research from the Fuller Youth Institute, who has done some of the best research out there on what happens to young people as they graduate our youth experiences. But that youth and young adults with the highest faith maturity. So highest faith maturity, we measure that based on how they articulate their faith. There was the National Study on Youth and Religion was done 2008, 2010-ish, and they interviewed lots of young people, youth and young adults, about how they articulated what Christianity was about. And there was a whole subsection that never mentioned Jesus. Large subsection. There was a whole subsection that very seldom talked about it having anything to do with their daily lives. And what we found is that a large percentage of our young people, the effective result of our youth ministries and children's ministries and upbringing in the church was actually what they ended up terming moralistic therapeutic Deism. Some of you have probably heard that term. But basically it means that Christianity is all about right from wrong, that God is someone you go to when you need something, and that's about all God's involved with. I hope we're about more than that. I hope we're about more than that. And that wasn't the curriculum. No one put out the moralistic therapeutic Deism curriculum, and we did our youth ministry as a result of that. But that was the effect of whatever we were doing. And so when we talk about faith maturity, youth and young adults with the highest faith maturity, so those who did talk about a life of following Christ, experienced more intergenerational worship. It's a correlation. Don't hear me saying that if youth are in worship, they will have high faith maturity. It doesn't quite work that way. It'd be nice if it were that simple. But those who experience more intergenerational worship as young people tended to have a greater faith maturity. The second one, also from Fuller, is that faith formation of youth and children is influenced mostly by what happens in the home and with their families. It just is going to be, for better or for worse. Fuller also will tell us that when it comes to the faith formation of our young people, parents tend to get what they are. So if parents are doing faith formation, their children are more likely to do that. If kids see their parents, you're talking about what you see others doing. If kids see their parents doing faith, living out their faith, studying scripture, engaging in that way, young people are more likely to do that. And this is going to trump what happens at church every single time. Every time. It doesn't mean it can't be overcome, but this is always going to be the greatest influence in the faith formation of our young people. Related to it, children's, teens, and young adults with strong ties to their families of origin are less likely to drop out of church. So,
would you repeat that?
Children, teens, and young adults with strong ties to their families of origin. So their nuclear families, their families of origin, are less likely to drop out of church. One of the statistics we get from Fuller is actually that 40 to 50% of our youth group graduates, not the kid that left after confirmation, not the ones that left when we stopped doing VBS, But the ones who make it all the way through, 40 to 50% of them are leaving church and not coming back. We've always had a young adult exodus. That's not new. But they tended to come back when they had kids. That's not happening to the same extent anymore. And people are having kids later, so there's a greater distance from those experiences. And so the strong ties to families of origin seems to be a correlation to help break down some of those statistics. So when we think about what this means for what we do as a church, it's not just about the faith formation of our young people, it's about how we support their families as a whole. And then finally, a high-quality parent-child relationship leads to higher religiosity, parental warmth. Parental warmth is key. So those good relationships between parents and their kids make a difference in faith formation. And so I think a lot of this, when we're talking about this, the family faith formation piece, we've got to think about how, not just what programming are we putting out for families. There's some great curriculum out there that connects parents and kids. It exists. But this is talking about something bigger. This is talking about a church system, a system and a structure that actually supports quality familial relationships. Any questions about this research? Yes?
My question is this only about the Episcopal faith
No.
practice? Okay,
This is ecumenical.
okay.
This is across the board. I would say that most of this research, with the exception of lifelong faith and maybe families in faith, the fuller research, I would say, leans heavily Protestant. But we see the same things with the number one scholar on intergenerational ministry, John Roberto, is Catholic. And so we have a lot of research in all areas. But yeah, good question. Yes?
What about the effect of going on a mission trip in terms of faith formation? Or connecting with an adult that's not a family member? Are
Yes.
they significant factors as well?
Things like mission trips are, I mean, it doesn't necessarily increase that longevity. So we're looking at lifelong faith here, is that longevity piece. The question of connecting with unrelated adults, there is all kinds of evidence that is extremely key. So families are important, but we also find out, and this is one of the directions we can talk about this afternoon if we want to go down this road, is the Search Institute does secular research on child and youth development. And what they have found is that developmental relationships, or what they call them, are key to the development of our young people. And we can connect that directly to faith. I'm actually about to be part of a project where we do that work to make the explicit connections to faith. But they say that every young person needs a minimum of 5 adults in their life, pouring into them, being in a relationship with them. And there are actually categories of what those relationships need to entail. They call them developmental relationships. So you can write that down and you can look it up on the internet. There's plenty of information from Search about that. So absolutely.
That 5 would be at different points in their life?
No. At any given time.
Any good?
At any given time. Yeah. And most churches I know should be able to handle that without any problem based on the ratio of young people to adults in the church. Pretty often. So. All right. So when we look at our context, so this is kind of summarizing some of this. Cross-generational relationships are key, both within the family and among the whole ecosystem of church. So that developmental relationship piece is absolutely important to remember, that 5-to-1 ratio. Often when we think about young people's programs, we think about it the other way around. How few adults can I have to still take them on the mission trip, right? We need this many adults minimum to make this trip happen or make this event happen. And we got to flip that. When we look at our young people, we want them to see a whole web of relationships. There's actually one model for this called faith webbing. Gary Cook is the one that there's a little mini book about it. And he starts with youth. That's his focus, and challenges those youth to find, to build relationships with 5 adults and to pick those 5 adults for themselves. And I will tell you, there's probably not a more powerful experience you can have than for a young person to come to you and ask you to be part of their faith web. Right? Not to seek them out as a mentor, but for them to seek you out, to be a friend. So cross-generational relationships, familial and non-familial, are key. I didn't bring them with me, but I can send, and you can create it, but you can create a sort of a worksheet to kind of see where people are with some of this too. And my favorite one, it kind of has a spider web on the back to kind of give that image, but it'll put in the center different age groups. So, 0 to 3, 3 to 7, 7 to 11, 11, however you want to break it down. And on one side, there's lines on either side, and on one side, the idea is to name all of the people of those age groups who are investing in you. And then on the other side is to name people of all of those age groups who you are investing in. Because this isn't just a top-down thing. We don't just have a bunch of stuff to offer our young people. I have learned as much from elementary school kids as I have learned from my most wise mentors. And so this becomes a whole mutual experience. Here's where it gets really interesting. A lot of times we talk about adults and children as our 2 generations, quote unquote, that we are trying to bring together. Or adults, youth, and children. That's making this assumption that 18 and up is all one monolithic entity. It's not the case. We have 5 generations of adults in our churches. We have 1 generation of children and youth. 4 to 6 generations in most of our churches. That's 4 to 6 different generations that we are trying to bring together. And here's the thing, generations are cultures. So when we think about something like a mission trip, if you are preparing to go to another country, what are things that you might do to prepare to engage people in a different country?
Learn the language.
Learn some language. You might not be able to learn it all, but you can learn some. You want to try to learn some.
Learn the culture.
Learn some culture. What might that look like?
What's appropriate to wear?
What's appropriate to wear, okay?
What's the food like?
What's the food like?
What time do they usually eat?
What, yeah.
We went through
Customs.
that when we wanted to eat at 5 and they ate Spanish eat at 7.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
I deal with that with my parents all the time. They want to eat at like 3 in the afternoon, and I'm like, it's not dinner time yet. Yeah.
I just have a question about that 4 to 6 generations. And does that mean active generations?
I'll show you the breakdown in just a second.
Okay.
Yep, great question. And that's one of the other rabbit holes we can go down this afternoon if we really want to delve into generational theory. Yeah.
I think one of the other things that goes along with language is the colloquialism that goes with each group of people.
Yeah.
It's not, when you make a comment about something very familiar to you, and these people look like you're from Tibet.
Uh-huh.
How do you bridge that gap?
Colloquialisms, idioms, things like that. At Disney World, so I live right next to Disney World, no big deal. It's a great life. But they always point, if they're sending you somewhere, they point with 2 fingers or with their whole hand. Because in certain cultures, pointing with 1 finger is offensive. And they know that. They've done their research. Because I'll tell you, Disney World is an international experience, not just Epcot. Yeah, Susan.
Avoid the tourist hangouts.
Oh.
Where the locals go.
Oh, go where the locals go. Ooh, you're getting me into that's an interesting metaphor to follow. So when we think about if we start thinking about generations as cultures, how often do we do the generational versions of these things before we engage with someone of a different generation? I find that that doesn't happen very often. A lot of that comes from the assumption that culture deals with geography. That if I grew up on the same street in the same house as my parents or my grandparents in Makokata, Iowa, that we're the same culture. We're the same race, probably. We grew up with some of the same families in the neighborhood. We grew up with some of the same industries. We went to the same schools. Same culture, right? Well, ethnically, yes. There are some definitions of culture there, but if we're talking about generational culture, my guess is Makokata, Iowa of 1955 is a different town than it is in 2018. It should be. That's just the way progress works. Somebody's nodding because maybe you were here then. We didn't grow up in the same place. It's not the same city. It's not the same town. It's not the same country. So just because we are the same race, the same ethnicity, grew up in the same place, when we're talking about generational culture, we have to think chronological space, not geographical. So when we engage across cultures, even though we have some of that same geographical grounding, our generational culture is entirely different. And so we have to do that cross-cultural work that we would do when we were engaging across ethnic or racial culture. We have to do the same work. And so if you have people who are good at that in your church, those are good resources to use when you're actually doing cross-generational work, because it's the same tools. I also teach some cross-cultural work as well. I use some of the same tools. One of the things we'll talk about this afternoon is a cross-cultural tool that works cross-generationally. And so this is it. Cross-generational relationships are cross-cultural relationships. If you hear nothing else today, if you get nothing else, this is a key understanding if you're going to do good cross-generational work. You have to approach it as though it's a cross-cultural experience. Does that make sense? Yeah. Questions about that? Like I said, we'll dig a little bit deeper into that this afternoon, probably. Yeah.
I studied for about 9 months in Washington, D.C. at something called the Center for the Family.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I mostly did research work. And one of the things I learned that was so significant was the emergence of two-job families.
Yes.
The emergence of media in terms of what a huge place it takes in people's lives now.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I come back to is, where is there time for cross-generational relationships? Because people are watching their TVs on their devices. They don't have time typically for their own families, much less the kid down the street or the kid at church, or to go to church in terms of some. Huge impact. And I was studying from the perspective of what the government could do to perhaps relate to this, and found that there was very little they could do, as in most cases. But anyway.
So, again, this is something we can talk about this afternoon. You are defining a relationship based on your own generational culture,
I don't think so.
as you think about that.
I think it's even more so on the younger generations than myself. They, where's the time to do anything?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good conversation, is how you build those relationships and where you find that time, and thinking about what relationship looks like is
I
part
have no
of it.
question about the desirability of building those relationships.
Oh, sure.
My question is, where do people find the time to do that?
Yeah, we can definitely dig deeper into that for sure. Yeah.
One of the things I was thinking about is, I grew up back east near Pittsburgh. And being from the Mon Valley, you had miles of steel mills.
Mhm.
You had a different thought process of how you worshipped.
Mhm.
Because there were all kinds of little churches, and if you didn't belong to the right church,
Mhm.
the families families just did not have the cohesiveness that they have today. When U.S. Steel went under, there was a change where it's like everywhere else. When something drastic happens, people finally decide to find God. And when they find God, they realize that it's not just them, but it's the kids, and it's the adults. It's just the whole gamut of people. And to see that through all of this, there is one steel mill still alive in the Pittsburgh area, and it's the town I grew up in. And that town has grown substantially in the Episcopal Church, which is so strange because it was such a tiny little microcosm.
Yeah.
And it's just interesting for me. I mean, I've been away from there for 45 years.
Yeah, but there's something that has happened that has sort of brought people together. And this is a great sort of dichotomy of how geography does play a part in this. Don't hear me saying it doesn't. But when we're talking generational culture, that's the chronological piece. But what you're talking about with the two parent working families, actually, interestingly enough, Phyllis Tickle, she talked about that the biggest turning point in the 20th century for faith formation was the birth control pill. Because we didn't realize that for years and years and years, we had built-in faith formation happening daily in the home because mom was doing it. We didn't formalize that. We didn't write curriculum for it, but it was happening through stories and through daily conversations. And when we let mom go to work, which I'm a fan of, we're not saying this is a bad turn. What we are saying is we had no idea how much that was really doing. And so one of the things that could be connecting some of these stories is also that we have to be more intentional about how we do faith formation as we run out of time in some ways, as we have a different pattern of life. That's how I would put it. We have a different pattern of life that we did before. And we can either go, oh man, wish we had it the way we did back when mom couldn't go to work. I don't think that's what we want to say, right? And so we have to look at 2018, the 21st century. Okay, now what is reality? Reality is our timing is different. The way that we organize our time is different. Our industries are different. How are we going to respond to that in a way that still forms faith in the same quality that we previously had, but with very different methods? So that's all wrapped up into this, and it sounds like there's one town that has started to figure how they're going to do that. And so it's so contextual. It's so very contextual. Very quickly, I do want to go through, because this is always a question, is what are the generations? And so these are our 6 generations. Greatest generation, the question of active, this is a very small group, but there are still a handful of folks born before 1925 who are very active in our churches. This is our smallest group, but they are still around. The silent generation, born between 1925 and 1945. These are most of our elders in our churches at this point. The baby boomers, born between 46 and 64. This is, in my experience, ecumenically, probably most of our church leadership nowadays. And then the Generation X, that was a placeholder name that never got taken away. If we talk a little bit about generational theory this afternoon, you'll hear a little bit more about that. Born between 65 and 80. Millennials, the current generation everyone loves to hate. It's a lot of fun to be one. Born between 1981 and 1996. We'll talk a little bit about where there is truth in some of the stereotypes and where we might need to reframe how we look at our generations. And then our youngest generation right now, born 1997, we're estimating till about 2015 right now, but we really don't know. We don't know generational shifts this early. We've got a placeholder name for them, Generation Z, that will eventually be replaced. There's a number of different ideas out there of what that might be. The one I see probably most likely in the actual generational theory world to come about is Homelanders. This is the generation that grew up in the 9/11 world. And so that is where you see that generational shift between 96 and 97. That's estimated anywhere between 95 and 2000. And that all has to do with knowing that 9/11 is the social crisis that we are going to define as the turning point for this generation. The question is, do we define that based on if you can remember it or if you were actually born after it? And so this is sort of leaning on anybody born 96 and later doesn't remember the event, but had to handle the aftermath and was brought up in the aftermath. So, questions on that? You may see some slightly different numbers, places. If they're super far off from this, I would ask some questions of it, but if they're close to these, that's fine. Yes, ma'am.
I read a study, many indicated that the first 10 years of life is what more or less forms the generation and what you're going to think throughout the rest of your life.
You're thinking of the Morris Massey work.
Yes.
So that is, yes. So just because you're within one of these does not mean that is even a monolithic group. We'll talk again this afternoon a little bit more about what we call cuspers, so in between generations, those of us who are born anywhere between 4 and 6 years on either side of a generational shift. What this is actually based on is not necessarily the individual experience, but this has to do with more sociological understanding. What we see, a couple of guys named Strauss and Howe in the late 80s started doing some research on generational history throughout the entirety of the American experiment, essentially, and went all the way back to the first settlers of our country and traced this all the way through. But they found a cycle that happened of 4 generational types that cycle over and over and over, and that's based around the alternation historically of social crises followed by spiritual awakenings. And you see that going back and forth throughout our history. We have a social crisis, we respond to it. By responding to a social crisis, we have a season of prosperity. Prosperity allows us to think a little bit more spiritually, and that's not necessarily religious, but spiritual. So our spiritual awakening of the 20th century was the civil rights movement. And all of the sort of 60s in transactional analysis, the I'm okay, you're okay kind of stuff, that kind of era was our spiritual awakening after the social crisis of the Depression and World War II. So those are ours. And so what you see is 4 generational types, starting with the greatest generation. This is a civic generation that came of age during a social crisis. The next generation is an adaptive generation who had to grow up, and in the aftermath of a social crisis, excuse me. The next is an idealist generation. Boomers get to enjoy the benefits of the prosperity that comes after that, and they get to come of age during a spiritual awakening. And then Generation X comes as a nomad generation that ends up coming after the spiritual awakening, but leading up to the next social crisis. And so when we look at the types, greatest generation and millennials are the same type. Silence and Generation X or Generation Z are the same type. So this is a big rabbit hole that we can dig deeper into if we want to this afternoon. So that's what this is based on. It goes together, but it's a bigger conversation. So Morris Massey's work is fabulous. So I'm about at my time. So I want us just to think about, in case I'm not spending time with you this afternoon, this is where I want to land, is thinking about faith formation with our young people through enculturation. Enculturation. And I love this definition. It's a little academic, so we'll pick it apart a little bit. In enculturation, one person is not understood as the actor and the other the acted upon, but rather both act, both initiate action, and both react. So when we're thinking about how we form faith of young people, we see, the research tells us, that intergenerational relationships matter. But if all we do is walk up to our young people, or give parents the tools to walk up to their young people and say, let me come tell you my great wisdom that's going to make your life so much better. Yeah, good luck on that one. That's not going to end well. No, I don't want to be told that, much less when I was 16 did I want that to happen. And so, particularly because of what we know about this youngest generation now, they have been told their opinion matters. We can have feelings about whether it does or not, but they've been told that. They believe that their opinion matters, that they have something to offer the world. And if we treat them as though we believe that too, we will get to share our wisdom with them. We will get that opportunity. They will allow us in. So, as we think about faith formation, I want you to think about that. And then this is my last little piece. This is from one of my favorite books. I don't care for the author. I've heard him speak, not a big fan of that, but this book is great. It's called Sticking Points. It's a business book about the 12 places that generations stick or compete in the workplace. You can easily translate it to the church. But he says, leaders love their people. If we love people, we won't try to change them. If we go into a relationship with a young person, trying to change them, if that's our desired outcome, then we're not going to get very far. We can only lead people if we quit trying to change them, and we can't quit trying to change them until we appreciate them. And we can't appreciate them until we understand them. So this afternoon, if we spend a little more time together, we're going to go into some of that understanding of how we do that work. But at minimum, just think about, how do you do that cross-cultural work of understanding better a generation that is different than yours? So, that's for this afternoon. This is my information in case you want to get in touch with me. I have cards here, and I have my coaching bio. I work with an ecumenical organization called Vibrant Faith, and so I do long-term coaching with churches as well as consultations and a number of different things. So you can find me online, you can find me on my website, email me, any of that. And I'm here today, obviously. So thank you so much. I'm glad to be with you and look forward to spending time with some of you this afternoon.